Megan and welcome to my channel. Today is episode 2 and I'm going to show you how I installed Shiplap into my home. I absolutely love the results that I got from this project, and I did a very large space, unlike a lot of other YouTubers who I've watched. They've done like maybe 1 wall or 2 walls. We did an entire room of Shiplap, and I want to show you how I did it. I want to show you the troubles I ran into and how I fixed them, and also show you some shortcuts and things that you don't really need to waste time doing. First thing you're going to need is plywood. We did not use real Shiplap, we used plywood. It would be even more costly to use Shiplap, and this was a costly project. YouTube and Pinterest made me think it was going to be done in under $100. No, definitely not. So we bought 12 sheets of plywood at about 15 bucks a piece. We went pretty middle of the road with the plywood. You can get underlayment, you could get really nice plywood. At the end of the day, it's plywood. Go with whatever is cheapest, and you can kind of sand around the edges if you need to. It does kind of split when you cut it. It's not a big deal. We didn't even sand ours. So like I said, 12 sheets of plywood is what we needed for our space, and we were covering a very large space. If you're doing a smaller wall, you might want to measure and just find out before you go to the hardware store how much you're going to need. The sheets run at about 4 feet by 8 feet, so you can do the math. Second thing you're going to need is a straight nailer, also known as a pneumatic nail gun. We bought a rigid 16 gauge 2.5 inch nail gun, and it was $170 at Home Depot. That's going to attach to a compressor. We bought a 6-gallon electric pancake compressor. It was about $140 at Home Depot. You're going to need nails to go into your nail gun, so we bought 2.5 inch finishing nails, about 10 bucks for a box of like 500, I think. We purchased a table saw. We got a 10 inch 15 amp Ryobi, I'm not really sure how to say it, table saw from Home Depot, and that was $130. We bought a rigid 15 amp 10 inch dual bevel miter saw with a laser, which is pretty cool. And we also invested in a jigsaw. We bought a Ryobi 4.5 amp orbital jigsaw, and that was 40 bucks. There were a couple other things that I had to purchase for this. One of those was paint. I needed 4 gallons total of paint because the walls that I were painting were previously green, and they were a dark green, which is my husband's idea of making the room look like a pool hall, I think. I'm not really sure. But I had to paint over that. So for that, I used a gallon of primer and a gallon of white, super white paint from Benjamin Moore. And then I purchased 2 gallons of paint to paint over my Shiplap. And I decided to go with Benjamin Moore in the color White Dove. It is a perfect neutral, on the cool side, white paint. Highly suggest it. And I needed about 2 gallons to paint everything. I had to do 4 coats total because the plywood really soaked up a lot of the paint. So yeah, 4 coats. And then I purchased some caulk for trim, doors, windows. Other things that I used that I already had that I didn't have to invest in: a ladder, a level, needed a paint tray, a roller, a paintbrush to cut, drop cloths, a measuring tape. The last thing I needed was nickels. You'll see other people using other things, and a lot of people using nickels. I went the nickel route. Make sure you have a decent amount because you will lose them. Okay guys, so let me just say that if you are painting your Shiplap white, you want to make sure that the walls that you're applying the Shiplap to are white. And if you're painting it some other color, then that's the color you're going to want to paint your walls. If you don't, you're going to be able to see that color peeking through between your planks. We decided on 8-inch planks for our Shiplap, so here we are cutting our first piece of plywood down to 8 inches. A lot of people on the internet say that you can go to Home Depot or Lowe's to get this done, and that's simply not true. We checked both hardware stores in our area and they said no. Before I can hang my first plank on the wall, I need to get my compressor ready to go. So I'm going to plug it in, and then I'm going to attach the hose that connects to the compressor, and then the other end is going to connect to my nail gun. And then I'm going to turn the compressor on to fill the tank and then transfer over all of the air to the nail gun. When we hang our first plank, we're going to hang it at the top of the wall, right underneath the ceiling. I'm going to make sure it's completely level before I nail it in. And even though my first plank is level, it doesn't look like it's running straight across from this point of view looking at this, and that's fine because I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fill in those little gaps at the top near the ceiling with painter's caulk. And so I am nailing into my studs to make sure that this plank is completely secure, and I do go back over and I do all 4 of the edges so that they don't peel up. And you can do this with a hammer and nail, but it's going to take you a lot longer if you're doing a large space. If you're doing a small wall and you don't own a compressor and nail gun, it's probably something you can do. But if you're doing a large space, I would make the investment. It makes the project so much faster. So our next plank is going to be shorter than our first plank because of the length of our wall. So we're going to take a measurement here and find out how long it needs to be. Back to our table saw, we're going to cut another 8-inch plank. We're going to mark our plank where we want to make our cut. 74 inches here for this one. So then we're going to take it over to our miter saw, and this is where we're going to make our vertical cut so that it fits the length of our wall. And because of the type of miter saw that we have, we're not able to drag that blade through, so we have to flip our plank and make sure that we cut it at the same spot on the other side. That's where the laser comes in pretty handy with this. The plywood tends to kind of split and fray at the ends, and I did not take the time to sand it. It really didn't matter. Once I got that plank up there and got it nailed in, you just really couldn't tell that there was any of that going on. And I knew that I was going to go back and paint, and I'm kind of into the rustic look anyway. If it's not perfect, I'm totally fine with that. And so we've got our nickels and we are putting them up between the boards so that we have the right spaces. We already checked to make sure the boards at the top were level, so we don't really have to check every single board at this point. We can just start nailing our planks in, measuring, cutting, and nailing them in, using our nickels to space these boards out. So here's where we ran into our first speed bump. We have a security system and we have a motion sensor there. So here you see my husband measuring the width and height of that little square we were going to need to cut out with a jigsaw. Back to the table saw to cut another 8-inch plank, and we'll also take it over to the miter saw to cut the length of it. And since our motion sensor is a rectangular shape, it's pretty easy just to draw a quick template based on the measurements of the motion sensor. And this is how we're going to do all of our odd cuts. Everything that we need to do around the windows, around our motion sensor, all of our outlets and light switches, this is what we're going to use. And this is our jigsaw, and it just cuts straight in, and you have to have control over the direction you're moving that blade in. So it can be a little tricky, especially because with the plywood, as you can see, it does split and kind of crack and tear. So you have to be precise the first time you go through. And we did the same thing on the next plank. We measured our window frame and we cut out with the jigsaw, and now we're using our nickels to space our next plank. And if you look closely, you can see it's not perfect over that window frame. It was hard to get that angle. Nothing is level in this house, so it wasn't a straight across line. It kind of was a diagonal down that we had to cut. But I'm going to use caulk to go back in and fill that in, and you're not going to even notice it. It's not a big deal. And this is how we continued to work through most of this project until we got to the bottom. And my husband cut the 8-inch planks for me, and then I hung them using my nickels to space, checking every here and there to make sure that I was still level. One thing we neglected to capture on film was cutting out our holes for our outlets and light switches. And in order to get your jigsaw in there without cutting straight into the board, you have to drill a hole in the middle of your rectangle or whatever cutout you're making to get your jigsaw in there to be able to kind of creatively, as you can see, cut your shape out. Another thing to keep in mind, since most people's houses are not perfect, is that as you keep moving down, you keep making your measurements just in case. In this case, on that part of the wall, our measurements got a little bit smaller as we went. I think it changed from the top of the window to the bottom of the window by about a full inch.
When it came to measuring for the bottom of the window frame, we kind of just had to take measurements and just draw our template freehanded. And like I said earlier in the video, it wasn't perfect, and that's fine, because I went back around and I caulked really close in, near the frame of the window, and you cannot tell at all. Now that everything's caulked and painted, you can't tell. So get as close as you can with things like this, but don't get frustrated if it's not perfect, because it just won't be. So when we got to the bottom of our wall, we realized that it wasn't going to be an 8-inch plank. We were going to have to measure, and we were going to have to cut something a little bit slimmer than that. So that's what we did, and it fit perfectly. And this was our 4th wall that we did, and it was our smallest wall. It was only 4 feet wide, so we got through this pretty quickly. All my planks are up and I can start painting. So I went ahead and I cut first around the windows and the tops of the ceiling and near the baseboards at the bottom. I cut everything, and then I went back and I rolled it all out. This is probably the easiest part of the project, but like I said, I did have to do 4 coats, and I did go back in between all of my walls near the ceiling and near the baseboards, and I caulked. And I just want to point this out real quickly. If you don't get longer screws and spacers for your outlets, you will see a gap in between the faceplate and the actual outlet. So that is something you have to pay attention to. And this is my final result, which I am super, super pleased with. I haven't had a chance to decorate in here yet, but as soon as I can, we are going to be hanging some pictures up and redoing the rest of this room. The shiplap was just the very first step. Thanks for checking this out. Make sure you leave a comment if you have any questions, and I will see you in my next project.